make sure that the solution that you provide actually solve the problems as opposed to create more noise, more data someone needs to understand, more alerts and all of that stuff that just makes life much tougher. I think it's part of the issue.
We're excited to welcome Gidi Cohen, CEO and co-founder of BonFy.ai. Gidi is a pioneer in cybersecurity risk management, founder and former CEO of Skybox Security, and a seasoned entrepreneur with decades of experience in AI, analytics, and enterprise security. With over 20 years in the field, he's helped enterprises worldwide manage and reduce risk, and now focuses on securing Gen AI-generated content at BonFy.ai. In this episode, we explore his journey, why Gen AI demands a new approach to content security, and how AI can be both a source of and a defense against risk. What would you say is the thing that scares you about AI?
It becomes really, really smart. I mean, as much as we're talking about hallucinations, some flaws in models, it's actually amazing. I think there's a real risk to the human race.
Winston Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." How does that quote resonate with you?
Yeah, it actually resonates really well. But if you asked before that, just thanks for having me in your podcast. That's a pleasure to be here. Yes, so the quote I think summarizes pretty well kind of my mode of operation. I love to tackle big problems. Sometimes it's not clear ahead of time whether they are even solvable, but they are worthy the journey. And part of what I learned right in my life, also by reading Churchill, but actually practicing it now in my third startup, that you shoot high, you always find kind of a way to march forward. It's not always easy. Sometimes some blood, kind of tears and sweat and all of that comes with that. But it's definitely part of the journey, part of actually what I enjoy, despite sometimes ups and downs and the stress that come with that.
One of the things that you said to me, Gidi, in our preparation call is you like to go after the big problems, the unsolvables, the ones that are challenging. Why is that?
I think probably part of the inner me says that I can do stuff maybe better to deal with some problems that others could not address well. And I can say that by shooting high and actually targeting very complex problems since I was actually a kid, it's not necessarily just in my startup life, and being able to prove to myself that I can do that, actually it creates kind of like your own reward system in the satisfaction of the ability to tackle that. So it almost becomes kind of your expertise, right? Your superpower, right? So take something big, decompose it to create break it down, right? To kind of some simpler problems that it's not guaranteed that you can have, even each one of them can successfully tackle. But when you do that and you have a strategy and a lot of energy and a lot of kind of stamina, right, to get and to deal with some challenges along the way, there's some chance at least you'll be able to solve it. And I think that the more I did it since I was a child, right, that was kind of rewarding the satisfaction of being able to tackle the impossible in a sense.
One of the things that I see in my field, right, whether it's tech recruiting, venture, or sales in general, is I found some of the best people I've hired have come from military background. Right. And you're one of those individuals who has come from a military background, and you have this ethos around solving the unsolvable, right? Going after the big problems, which ultimately might have, a straight correlation with big TAM markets. What connection is there, and what value do you see in having that sort of background and that sort of mindset has an impact on the technical aspect of building a company like BonFy?
So I think that beyond, right, the love for technology and innovation, inventing stuff, I think what comes with some military background, again, it wasn't my career, it was 5 years career, right? So it wasn't the longest, but it wasn't kind of like a couple of days at the nearby kiosk. Is the mission-oriented element of that, right? At the end of the day, you're trying to tackle significant issues, otherwise probably you would not put soldiers or officers on the problem anyway. So that typically there's a lot at stake on one end. And typically it's things, especially if you're looking on the technology part of, let's say, military service, like where I served, which is the Israeli kind of NSA equivalent, 8200, that it's basically a technology unit that, its design or its purpose is actually to find kind of ways technology, right, to achieve those kind of big missions. So almost by definition, you have to tackle something big, which was not solvable with technology. That's why you are there, right? That's the reason for existence. So that's just a starting point. And the challenges are always complex, right? Because there's always adversary, whoever they might be. So they never make it easy for you, right? So the bar is rising and rising. So as I said, by definition, the challenges are enormous. And if the organization, in this case military, right, decide to put the resource on top of that, means that it's super, super important. So it's a combination of both the innovation side, use of technology, pushing the envelope of technology on one hand, and the energy and the satisfaction by accomplishing a mission.
What you're saying is that the mindset of having that sort of background when you're building a startup in Silicon Valley, and is it somehow connected that there's a certain pedigree, certain willpower, certain energy that comes with challenging going after the biggest challenges that stems from the mindset that it takes to be successful at building a startup in correlation to coming from that military background?
Yeah, I would say that it's not shocking, right? There are so many startups and so many of them are so successful in cybersecurity and related spaces, networking, and some other areas. Because I think that's what it takes in startups. At the end of the day, right, you need to shoot high, right? You need to hope for the great success and all of the rewards that come with that. But at the end of the day, I think that the drive is not that. It's not about them making money. That's the reward of being successful, right? The drive is to tackle some big problems, do it better than others, right? It's also part of the competitiveness. But I would say kind of the sense of accomplishment of this big mission of bringing technology or solution to a problem which was unsolved before or almost completely unsolved before, and actually tackle it in a way that makes a difference in the market. And that's, I think, it's required both, right? The energy, the technical talent on one end, but also kind of the very mission-oriented approach to life and to the companies, startups.
You've probably faced a lot of dead ends, right? When it comes to building a startup or building any sort of technology, there's challenges that comes with a startup. How do you reframe that technical dead end with like a creative opportunity?
Hey, first of all, I can tell you it's not simple, right? I would say that what typically is the best source of energy for me, especially when tackling challenges, can be technological challenges, go-to-market, organizational, whatever, is actually painting the future. And a lot of people interpret it as kind of like that I'm an optimist, which I think I am, but it's not because of optimism. It's actually because of strategy, right? I believe that at the end of the day, to be able to accomplish big things, tackle big problems, deal with significant challenges, you need to have a plan. And the first step in having a plan is some imagination of the future, right? You need to portray the picture of where you want to be and find a way to get there, and then rally the troops to get there, right? So a lot of people, again, interpret it as kind of optimism. How do I know that the future will be bright? I said, I don't know. I want to paint the picture and then find a way to get there. And that's, that I think, typically the best source of energy for me, right, in marching forward. So is to have a goal, have a strategy, have a plan, and then drive the execution, as opposed to just getting with the minutiae of the day-to-day execution where it can drown everyone. But then you can lose kind of sense of direction or sense of purpose of why you're dealing with all of that, or sense of belief, right? That you can actually, while going through that, can achieve what you want. So big goals, strategy, and plan to execute is typically what drives me.
Gidi, I've worked with you for a while now, and one thing I've learned is, whilst you clearly do have the optimism, I can see it, but also I know from working with you, you also have that element of paranoia, right? That the deal's not done until it's done. You're an optimist, but you'll also have that paranoia. How do you balance the two? How do you know when to push the buttons of being an optimist and driving forward, and when you got to be a little bit cautious?
Yeah, I would say that they are actually related to each other. So it's kind of like not two different parts of me, right? One is paranoid and the other is optimist. The paranoia keeps you alive, right? And actually, I think all of us are wired that way. So it keeps you alive, keeps you targeted, keeps you focused. And again, as long as you tunnel that into constructive progress motion, it's good. If not, then you're struggling, right? So that's kind of the exercise, right? Almost daily, I'm waking up 5 a.m., 6 a.m. with things of what can go wrong. By 8 a.m., I have a pretty good plan of how to deal with it, right? So it's kind of like a great source of energy, stressful at times, but stress comes with the challenge. How to convert the stress, or paranoia, as you call it, right, to a great plan and hopefully great results at the end. That's, I think, what typically takes, right, to build a startup.
Gidi, what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur in today's market?
I think it takes a lot, right? So there are the outside factors, right? Targeting the right market, coming in the right time to that market, I'm sure that we'll discuss a bit of that later, right? If you're looking specifically on the BonFy. So all of that, let's call it outside factors, something you can control, but in many cases you just don't control, right? Economy, right? You don't control. So there are a lot of that. I would say that I think that a lot of what, at least I felt, kind of what works and what doesn't, including kind of my experience where I was successful more and where I was less successful in that, the ability, right, as I said earlier, right, to have kind of a clear strategy that is not based on guesswork, or it's not about betting. It's about kind of taking kind of a great balance, right, between resources you have, the targets you want to accomplish, with some kind of, let's call it risk management mindset, that you understand that a lot of things you do, you need to make decisions, but you don't always have all of the information. So you need to kind of take basically a very rational approach to deal with stuff. I would say that's one. I think second is focus, which is something that I definitely kind of learned over the years to get better in. Focus in the sense that the importance of doing less things and do them well and become the expert, not just myself as an expert, but the company, the brand, expert in. And I think that's something critical. Definitely in the early days in the market where you want to make your first inroads into a space, you need to be really, really good at what you do, because otherwise, why buy you and not kind of 50 other vendors that are there 20 years already? Maybe not great, maybe a bit outdated, but they're with resources, with brand, with this proven capabilities. So I would say focus in creating not just competitive edge, but by creating clear value in differentiators, so you can actually penetrate with that to the market, and then capitalize on that. I think it's critical, and that takes some learning, right? Because all of us have appetite to do more. We think we can do more. Maybe our past told us that you can do more, but it's not always kind of the optimal way to build a business.
Focus is important, especially when you start now. But what point do you feel is perhaps okay for a company to start maybe diversifying and maybe having a second product or a second discipline of area of focus? Is there a time for that, or do you just fail if you go down that road?
I'm a true believer, we are in software business, right? So I'm a true believer in platform strategy, which basically means let's take some foundation. Of course, you can build along the way. It's not kind of like one-time building of that, and actually adding more capabilities and more products on the foundation, which makes a lot of sense, right? It lets you both target the value bring to the market in a more specific way. It helps you to monetize it much more effectively, get to great parameters like net retention rate and other stuff that the investors appreciate. So there are a lot of benefits for that. I think that there's no specific time except for what I mentioned earlier, right? The ability, right, to do things well, right? Because you're going to be measured as a startup, not because you have some great idea or because you wear some blue shirt, maybe others don't. You solve really important problems to customers. Let's say in our case, CISOs and their teams, right, in enterprises, but solve a really important problem and solve it really well. So you have actually the right to exist. And as long as you can do that, if you can add more capabilities along the way, let's say another module, another product that actually keeps you in the same kind of strategy, right, in achieving the big goal in terms of where you want to be in the market, and to do it well, there's no reason to wait with that. Typically just takes resource and some maturity of solutions. So there's some pacing, depends on the domain, right? Domain resources until you get to that level of maturity that makes sense. So you know it when you see it. So I think the strategy is great, just has to be kind of measured, let's go that way, with the ability to execute.
As far as cybersecurity is concerned, what would you say the industry has failed in solving over the past 20 years?
I think the industry just made it way more complex than it needs to be. If you think about when I started, let's say, got into the cybersecurity space maybe 25 years ago, there were probably very, very few hundred of vendors, few spaces, which is fine. Of course, there's a lot of ability to innovate more. So I'm not saying that it was at the peak of its market abilities to provide value. It wasn't, right? That was just a starting point. But think about if now that there are thousands of products out there, if every large enterprise has between 50 to 100 security products and vendors they are trying to put together in some workable fashion, especially when they have some resource constraints, and everyone is resource constrained. Even if you have 1,000 people in the security team, probably you needed 2,000. If you have 10, probably you needed 30, right? So the teams, though they grew along with budgets over the last 20 years on one hand, the complexity of the network infrastructure, the IT stack has to be protected. Plus, the amount of security tools that need to put somehow together each one of them might be complex, but to put them together in working fashion, it's almost a mission impossible. It's not shocking at all why there are still attacks going on despite all of the level of investment. Just too complex to understand whether you're actually protecting the organization. Are you leaving exposures in the organization unknowingly just because of the complexity? There are so many alerts that no one can, it's kind of like seeing the forest for the trees in many cases. So of course, along the way, along the years, there were more solutions developed for the purpose of consolidating events, running multiple products together, right? So there's of course a lot of innovation about how to consolidate, but the reality that the entropy in the space is growing all the time, as opposed to being kind of reduced. And that's a huge load to the organizations that are consuming those technologies.
I mean, cybersecurity is such a big space, right? And there's, as you said, we've gone from hundreds of companies to thousands of companies. Is there room for more companies?
I think there's room for better companies. In a sense, so let's define better, right? And I'm sure that there are great, all of those thousands of companies have great engineers, have great management, etc. Better companies in a sense that solve customer problems and not solve only technical issues or provide another function in the, let's say, toolbox available for security teams. So I think that the amount of problems in the security space, security, compliance, governance is significant. It's not reduced over the years, it's probably more. But some of the solutions are not solving business problems. They're providing technical functions that leave a lot to be a big gap that is falling on either additional type of solutions that need to somehow orchestrate all of it together, or on the security teams themselves to deal with it. So I think focusing on the end user, what kind of big problems they need to solve, make sure that the solution that you provide actually solve the problems, as opposed to create more noise, more data that someone needs to understand, more alerts and all of that stuff that just makes life much tougher. I think it's part of the issue. I believe at least security vendors that are going to focus on the business problems, big business problems, and solve them well technically and elegantly in a way that consumers, the enterprise, right, that are consuming those solutions can actually absorb them and become more efficient, can actually reduce risk, etc., will be very successful. And I think many others are typically adding complexity or adding challenges. At the end of the day, if you're looking at the equation of if I reduce enough risk for the level of effort that I need to put in the system, in most of the cases, the answer is no. And I think that's part of the challenge in the space.
As far as like building better companies is concerned, another amazing company, Wiz, one of the key reasons why Wiz is successful. I've spoken to many people who work with Wiz or even customers of Wiz, and they say they're just really good at listening to the customer. For you, when you're building BonFy, how do you balance between listening to a customer and maybe deciding when you shouldn't listen to a customer? Maybe their request, especially in the early days when you have design partners and you're building the product, how do you balance listening and maybe pushing back a little bit?
First of all, I love talking with customers. It's fun, it's enjoyable, you learn a lot, right? Regardless if it's exactly what you want to hear in the discussion or not. So I can tell you, even in as much as I've experienced before BonFy, right? Just in BonFy, I probably talked to 150 CISOs over the last year and a half. And I would say that in general, I always like to listen. It doesn't mean that customers are not going to invent the product for us. They can share problems, they can share the priorities, they can provide also feedback on product ideas or concepts that we are putting on the table and does it make sense or not. And we're getting already great feedback as we just launched, but working with design partners, we're getting great feedback, and some of it was not our intuition initially. Hence, we took it in, making maybe some change to the plan. Some of that we did, some of it will show up in the roadmap. But customers are not going to invent products. They are not also putting the product management hat, because sometimes they are, part of product management or part of, let's say, CEO role or founder of a company is actually to put all of that in the context of business, right? Some problems in a certain way are not worthwhile to pursue, right? Our decision, right, as a vendor, because sometimes maybe the technology is impossible to be done. The cost structure will be too high, which the customer will not pay for. It might be that it just takes a lot of other risks that it doesn't make sense to start to take on. So that's our business decision, right? To understand based on our experience, based on our judgment, based on what we see in the market, how to take this input in. So I think that, again, getting input is 100% critical as much as possible. But at the end of the day, founders of companies, product management function, whoever is deciding about product strategy, needs to own the decisions, right? Decisions not going to be done by anyone else. Maybe add one more point to that, and especially for startups, right? They want to kind of innovate and bring kind of new angle to the market, solving problems that were not solved properly before. If you're going to ask people, okay, what do you want? It's going to be how to fix the things that did not work before, right? Typically. And that's not what we want to do, right? We want to tackle big problems and we want to tackle them in different ways. So we want to understand the problems. We want to instead get reflection on what we're innovating, but we don't want to be a Me Too company or slightly better mousetrap to the same problem. Hence, need input, but we need to apply our own judgment of what to do with it.
Going back to your point at the beginning, you're building for the future, right? This optimistic view about where the world will be. And some of it is, as you said, customers are perhaps, unhappy with existing solution providers, these vendors who haven't delivered the best products. And the request they might give you as a design partner is do this better, whereas you're thinking ahead. And when we look at existing solution providers, right, why have they failed or fallen short when it's come to data security?
The main reason is because they want to solve the technical problems that seem to be feasible to solve and not address the business problems that needed to be addressed. So I can give some specific examples, right? It's pretty easy in our technology for 20 years to look for a pattern, let's say in the email or a file, let's say social security number. Let's look on those 9-digit sequence with maybe dashes in between and say, great, this is the social security number. That's a very easy problem to solve technically. Could have been solved 40 years ago, maybe with kind of machine learning technologies to provide some context around it over the last few years, even 10 years, can do it more accurately. So we have the technology, let's apply it to a challenge of, let's say, information leakage, privacy, etc. But you know what? That's only a very small part of the equation. Let's take the social security number example. If I'm, let's say, your service provider, and let's say we're exchanging between us, right, your social security number so I can provide you the service. Let's say just for the sake of example. Probably the privacy violation we just did is minimal, right? It's your social security number, you decide to give it to me, maybe it's all good. If I'm taking, let's say, kind of your social security number and by mistake or not, sending it to someone else, that's a big privacy violation. How can you decipher which case is an issue, which one is not? Just by looking on pattern or some textual analysis. You cannot. So basically, kind of all of those solutions over the last 20 years, there are a lot of data security companies miss context completely. They focus all the time on the what is the content about, but not who it is about. Who is the sender? Who is the receiver? Who has the rights to the content? So all of those basic questions that they allow you, let's say if you were to judge if certain email is, let's say, violating some policies or not, you would want to know that, right? So they say, there's 9 digits, but maybe in certain context, it's okay. Maybe in certain context, it's not okay. How would you know? So that's what you want to apply. Data security tools over the last 20 years, let's call it that they were lazy or focused on the, let's call it easy problem to easy technical feature to develop as opposed to the right problem to solve. And I believe, I know it will sound controversial, but taking in our domain, as much as people are complaining for a great reason about the accuracy, false positives, the big deal in data security, which there are a lot, because of a lot of technological issues in a lot of those solutions, I think the much bigger problem is the false negatives. I think that probably 90 to 95% of the data security incidents are not detectable at all with those technologies, at all. And we can explain in details why, but that's not the issue. That's the type of problems that we want to solve, right? We want to make sure organizations can have accurate detection of issues, ability to prevent them, but to prevent maybe not 100%, but maybe prevent 95% of the issues and not 5% of the issues. I think that's part of the big issue, right? Take a function and try to sell it, right, and package as a data security tool versus understand what the real problem is and develop technology that can do that at scale, broad coverage, high accuracy, which is what we are focusing on.
I think now's the time to talk about BonFy. This breakthrough, right? The timing of this breakthrough. It's interesting, right? We've gone from understanding the way you think about things, you're going after the big problems in a way that's very much needed in this market today. Let's talk about BonFy. Why now? What is this technical breakthrough? Tell me about BonFy.
Yes, so first of all, just high level about the company, right? We are what you call content or unstructured data security company, brought from the ground up to help organizations deal with both the generated Gen AI-related content challenges that are plenty, will be much more, we'll talk about it in a second, but also about the human-created content as well. As we said, it was not addressed properly over the last 20 years. So basically, we want to bring basically a new platform to market. We call BonFy ACS, stands for Adaptive Content Security, with a completely different take of technology of how to tackle it in a way that actually can really help organizations to detect, prevent risk, understand what the threat actors that you need to worry about internally or externally by a proper technology that can actually understand data in the context of the organization, and the big underlying story here is the context, right? How to find context, business context, and how to apply it smartly to analyzing content. Take the example I mentioned earlier about, let's say, your social security number. If I understand it's you, and I understand you are, let's say, my customer, and I understand it's a legit way to exchange information, I would say, and it's your social security number, indeed what you send, maybe it's okay. With someone else, it's not okay, right? You need some context to make the decision. This is just kind of very simple little example. They are way more complicated than that. So basically the innovation is how to find context, how to apply it smartly so we can actually understand all of the content, AI generated, human created content, and give the chance to organization to understand risk and mitigate it ahead of the incident.
Like, really break it down for me as a use case. Give me an example of where BonFy comes in and solves a big problem.
So let's say take an example of breaking customer trust, right? One of my favorite topics. Almost every organization on earth has customers. They typically manage in different systems, CRM, marketing automation, maybe other tools where a lot of customer information is available, right? So there's a lot of context around that. So think about, let's say you want to make sure, right, that let's say a law firm, as a bank, think about investment bank. Okay, let's maybe take an investment bank example. Investment bank is working on some big transactions, market-moving transactions, big M&A, big divestitures, IPO plan, etc. Okay, it's super critical, right, to keep this information confidential, right, with the parties that are involved in that, maybe the lawyers, maybe auditors, and of course the companies that are the client of that investment bank. What kind of controls, let's say, the investment bank has, or what kind of assurance they can provide to their customers that their information is never getting to the wrong hands? Why it's important? It can kill deals. It can be a market-moving event with SEC fines and a lot of other, they can of course affect the trust and the brand reputation of that investment bank. How do you make sure that? So you can say, great, we're going to look for every time the name of the vendor is mentioned. But yeah, if it's a big vendor making an acquisition like Microsoft or Google, probably 50% of the notes will have that. Doesn't tell you enough. So how can you make sure, right, that in a systematic, automated, and accurate way, you can actually understand what kind of communication is legit in terms of risk, versus not legit? Just an example, right? So customer trust. How do you make sure you don't mix customer data when you communicate outside, when you take information internally, maybe for training with the customer sensitive data, when you are opening a Google Drive SharePoint site, you think that you're opening it for one customer, but actually it has information about other customers you interact with, and suddenly all of the customer information that you have is available to all of your customers, maybe the entire world. How would you know any of that? No one does. So this is just a great example where the context of the communication, applying the context of the organization, what you know about the organization to the context of communication, allows you to make this type of judgment. And I can give an example about same stuff about the IP leakage and privacy laws and specific regulations in financial services, insurance. At the end of the day, it's all the same, right? If you know who you're communicating about, to whom, by whom, you have a lot of context, and you do know, and you know it, and you can correlate with what is being communicated. Again, transaction information, private information, your own design documents in terms of intellectual property, or whatever it might be, and you put all of it together, you can actually have all of the data you need, or for the machine, let's call it that way, or humans, to make a decision if something is risky or not. Now, apply that for organizations, large organizations might have 1 million emails a day, may have billion files in the system, right? So you need to do what I just mentioned in large scale, fast, accurately, covering a lot of situations, not only the 2 or 3 examples I gave you, but any example the organization may come up, which is relevant for their organization, basically defining what bad content looks like. So it's a complex problem, right? And that's basically what we're doing.
It is complex. We are talking about customer trust, right? You're safeguarding that for your customers. How could your customers trust you? You know, what is it about BonFy that you're protecting against and defending against to ensure that your customers can trust you?
Yeah, there are a few very important elements there. First of all is security by design, right? It's both the technical side of that. Of course, we went through a lot of penetration testing and going through certifications, and we have a lot of experts within the company that are experts, right, in building kind of the soil technology. So let's go to the technical side of that. A lot of it is about the product itself, right? We have enough experience, both Danny, right, the other co-founder, and myself, and a lot of the team members in providing solution to enterprises, and we know what they are looking for. So basically developing capabilities that we know are needed, but also are not going to create more risk in the eyes of the customer because of that. So we apply that knowledge, right, both in terms of the capabilities in the product, how we develop that, how we test it and ensure that it's working properly. But I agree, it's a big deal, right? It's part of thinking about what we mentioned earlier about security tools or security solutions that maybe support a function, but may introduce more risk or more headache or whatever. We definitely don't want to introduce more operational load and definitely not more risk. We want to reduce risk and introduce efficiency. So it's a super important element in our business.
I can see that. And as I said, I haven't worked with you. I know the way you approach things, you and Danny. You're right. There are many, many companies out there. There's a lot of noise in the market. You know, as a customer myself to all these different vendors, sometimes it's so hard to figure out what's the best solution because of all the noise. What advice do you give to customers that you want them to be your customers, right? What advice do you give them about how they should think about vetting these vendors?
Yeah, I would say that just to be specific, right, in our space, right, not speaking for every space on earth, that I'm sure that there's a lot of expertise required, right, to evaluate companies in different spaces. But in our space, right, at the end of the day, dealing with data security, there are, I would say, two main dimensions. I would say maybe three even. So the first two like come together, which is the accuracy, right? The ability to accurately address broad set of risks on one hand, and to do it accurately, right, without false positive is table stakes, which I think that 99% of the data security companies fail miserably in that. That's part of what we discussed earlier, right? The ability to have low false negative, low false positive, true low false negatives, not for the 5% of the problems you're tackling, but for what the customers want to tackle is critical, right? Without that, I think every data security program either will fail or will provide very minimal value, which is what's happening now, right? People got maybe satisfied, maybe tired, right, with data security programs because they know they don't do a lot. They need to check the box that they do something. And they have very, very minimal use because of that. So accuracy, right? Those two dimensions, right? The coverage or the detection rate and the precision in doing that, critical. So that's first step. Second step is the ability to apply this capability in a multi-channel way. At the end of the day, right, data or information or unstructured data or content goes out or can be shared with the world in a lot of different ways. Do it by email, right? Very typical kind of corporate communication channel, definitely for the outside world. You can work in Teams or Slack. It can be by just putting some shared file repository and opening a link, right, for other people to access. It can be by using some SaaS application, uploading or copying and pasting information. So the point is there are a lot of different channels of how information is flowing, obviously, right? All of the tech stack and all of the innovation over the last 20, 30 years actually of that. So at the end of the day, right, you need a solution that not necessarily does everything, but can tackle effectively the challenges which are the most relevant, right, to your organization. Which again comes to BonFy. We're not claiming ever to do everything, right? Part of you asked earlier about trust, and I answered about security. Of course, the other part of trust, which is as important in my view, is the corporate culture, right? I'm a true believer in transparency internally, externally. There's one version of the truth. It makes life so much easier. So transparency is clear. That's typically how you build the trust, transparency, and of course delivering on what you're saying, and all of that comes together. That's basically part of the equation. And coming back right to multi-channel. So we're not claiming we do everything, but we design an architecture. That's what we are delivering now. That is designed to deal with many different types of communication channels with the same logic, right? So you can apply the same business context regardless if it's an email or it's a chat or it's just file share or anything else. So you know that you have one way to control a lot of those elements and you don't need to reinvent the wheel with different tool set of features that are incompatible between themselves and bring all the flaws of solutions that were developed over the last 20 years.
So the technology is basically repurposed for different solutions.
It's actually for different communication channels, right? So I would say it's the same overarching purpose, which is let's help organizations to detect, mitigate content risk, AI generated, human created, etc. So same purpose exactly with the same logic, same context, but you can apply it in different ways and simultaneously in different ways. So they are not incompatible ways, but actually simultaneously in different ways to different channels. So you can actually achieve the best coverage that you can of those information systems or information flows that you want to protect against those incidents.
Gidi, now we, I guess, touch on this other key problem in the market, or I would say problem, but a concern in the market, the enterprise AI collision, right? You've got this whole new world of risks with AI and real world AI pain around hallucination, lack of traceability, compliance, chaos, so many different, I guess, problems that customers have to worry about now. How does BonFy think about these things today?
First of all, that's one of the areas that we want to help with. Right. If you think about when we started the company early 2024, the reason we started is not because we only want to solve the old unsolved problems of data security, which absolutely we're doing, and we think can be completely transformational in the market as the market starts to adopt our approach. But the exciting part is actually to solve the emerging problems, because we believe that that's going to be a huge, if let's say the current challenge is pre-Gen AI did not convince organizations that what they have suck. Let's say, excuse my French, if they didn't understand that, they will get it now, right? If you're looking in the world where there's exponential growth of generated content, which means multiple things. One, huge volume means that humans are getting out of the loop more and more. Think about marketing automation, let's say using the Gen AI technologies, right? So do you see more and more people getting completely out of the loop because it doesn't make sense, right, to scale? Where they're getting partially out of the loop and just gloss over some content was generated and either cannot or don't effectively apply their judgment about risk of sharing these pieces of information or verifying it's correct or whatever. So bigger volume, more risk, less humans in the process. Okay, so think about the risk level that is kind of ahead of us in those organizations. So basically, when we designed the BonFy, we did not design just to solve the old problems. We actually designed it to solve the new problems, and along the way, address a lot of the unaddressed challenges that actually in the entire data security sector left to be solved. Take the example of I mentioned earlier, right, about mixing customer data. So you could say, okay, in the experienced investment bankers, let's just talk about them for a second, don't make a lot of mistakes. They do a bit. I used investment bankers in the past, got other people's data, but I agree it doesn't happen a lot, right? You're focused, you're not working 75 clients at the same time. There will be limited mistakes, and maybe saying at the end of the day, oops, sorry, might be enough. But think about, let's say those people may use, and they are, or the analysts are using ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, other technologies to generate a lot of the content and the beautiful presentation they provide, and actually analyze a lot of the information that came from their client that they are trying to package and beautify as they are selling or taking public. Do you know what kind of information got in? Do you know what kind of maybe training or learning was done by the solution you kind of used based on your client-sensitive data? Did everyone read every piece of thing that your ChatGPT or Copilot generated? And now you're sharing it, let's say, and filing to SEC? Really? And then you trust it? It's crazy. So as I said, I think the world will transition from getting used to unacceptable technologies to being crazy if they're not going to apply appropriate controls on this type of problem.
I love that. That problem statement is so real right now. One, I've been a recipient of someone else's portfolio landing in my inbox. That's happened. And it's annoying because when you're seeing it, even though it's got someone else's name on it, you're probably thinking, wait, my name's going to be somewhere else, right?
So coming back to trust, right, which is almost everything we have as business, right, or is our reputation, can lose it so quickly.
And I remember getting on the phone to my investment banker at the time, and it was frustrating, not because, hey, I'm going to delete this, but hey, what's happening to my data? The other thing is, you're right, we're becoming super dependent as an economy on ChatGPT, on Grok, and all these different solutions that it looks great, as you said, the content looks amazing, but who's reading it? It is hallucinating, potentially, but also, can we really trust it? Because at the end of the day, it's called data and AI for a reason, right? You can't have the AI without the data. Is the data accurate?
Let's translate hallucination to business problem, which is typically integrity, right, of the business. Right? Hallucination sounds like it's a fun word to use and use a lot from, let's say, the data scientist world, and AI, it's good for the press. But at the end of the day, think about if you have a business where you produce content, it doesn't matter if it's internal, like a memo about, a customer meeting, or you're creating some marketing tool for the outside world, or you're getting public and you're filing something for SEC or whatever, and you're just not absolutely sure it's correct. Think about the ramifications of that. It's huge. And that's beyond whether you are leaking confidential information. A lot of the confidential information organizations have is not theirs. It's actually their customers, right? Think about your CRM. Yeah, the collective of this collection called CRM, it's your data, right? Because that's how you serve customers, sell to them, etc. But it has a lot of their information, right? You are a custodian of their information. So without actually having a tool, a solution like what we provide that actually can understand this content in this context, coming back to what we discussed probably 30 minutes ago, it's going to be, I think, very tough for organizations, right, to actually develop trust in themselves, not talking about others sharing information with them, like service providers or customers or whatever. So we believe it's, as we use the word trust a lot in our podcast so far, I think trust is the essence of information, essence of relationship between organizations and people. And when you lose that, or you lose the confidence that you know what it is that you are saying, a lot of problems will arise. And that's why we think it's going to become a huge problem. And that's why it's exciting for us as a startup, right, to tackle it. We maybe get back to your first 5 minutes of the podcast about your questions, like you tackle big problem. That's what I like to tackle. Not just the technology to do it, but actually tackle a problem that is emerging. Not everyone gets it yet. I mean, people get it, but probably more theoretically than, feeling it in hand. But it will happen, and I think it will happen big time without the proper controls.
Do you see that, the future implications of this? Will data be the key to customers adopting AI, especially enterprise customers?
Solutions like ours, you mean? Yeah,
Well,
I'm sure. I think that the sooner organizations, let's maybe step back. If you think about the security space, at the end of the day, there are a few drivers why organizations are adopting solutions, right? Because you say security is an overhead. Why would you want to spend money on something which doesn't either produce more sell or improve your efficiency at the bottom line? You do that because it's an enabler for the business, right? The risk tolerance of the business is influenced dearly by the ability, because of the reliance on technology, on the effectiveness of the security controls, right? So you have more, if you can mitigate risk, you actually can do more in your business, right? Which is enabling that. So I think that what will happen in the space, like happen in every wave of adoption of technologies in the security space, it's driven typically by a mix of big incidents, regulatory compliance requirements, force you to put the right type of controls, whatever the controls are, technical controls, or administrative or reporting, audit controls, and the ability to show that you have actually real efficiency that you introduce by the adoption of those type of technologies. And I believe that our space specifically, or the data security space at large, is ripe to get the efficiencies due to all of the false positives, etc., ripe to improve risk by reducing false negatives, specifically basically being able to cover much bigger set of problems, and to do it automatically at scale that will fit actually the adoption of AI technologies, again, when humans are getting out of the loop, and the only thing which is left is for the machine, right, to act like the human and apply the judgment on every piece of content, which might be important.
You're right. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you're right. Security isn't something that, like my team, sometimes when we onboard new members of staff and they have to look at the Okta and the Kanji and the CrowdStrike, and they're sitting there in the background, and the Mimecast, and they're wondering, what is this? It's just, you don't need to worry about it. It's just there, but it's there to protect you. It's like an insurance policy. Gidi, what about the investors, right? Right, you're VC backed, and we've been talking about the customers and the problem you're solving for the customers. But as far as the investors are concerned, and I remember asking you this months ago, I asked you how, when we were first working together, and asked you how big is this TAM? When I speak to my candidates, what do I say to them? And the answer was it's huge, right? And from what I'm hearing and everything I've known about your company ever since we started working together, it sounds like a huge TAM. Have you thought about that question since we spoke about it maybe 6 months ago? Now with more engagement with more customers and seeing the market opportunity, how big is this market?
Between us, it's tough to quantify, right? That's the reality, right? It's tough because it's influenced by two big forces that I think will actually increase a lot the TAM, but that requires some imagination of how much. One is the AI adoption in general, not just the AI security element. And why I'm saying AI adoption, think about every big technological wave. There's a derivative of that wave, which is typically few percent, 5, 10%, depends on where it is in the stack, which is actually, at the end of the day, the opportunity in the security and related type of sectors, right, to be able to enable it. is to secure it, for secure the infrastructure to run it, whatever it might mean, right? Depends on this technological innovation. So if you imagine what might be just the AI in the world 5 years from now, in terms of how much business is going to be paid for technologies that are enabling, it doesn't matter if it's model, applications, infrastructure, and everything else, right? To utilize and capitalize on the AI technology to reach trillions, right? That. Think about enjoying, let's say, basically segment that will be a few percent of that. We're talking about really kind of large segments. And that's before incorporating the historical, current, and future value of the data security market, which is ripe for disruption as well. So at the end of the day, right, there will be kind of those two opportunities that are coming together. One is driven by great innovation and adoption, massive adoption by enterprises that just started, just the baby steps now, on one hand, which will create a lot of opportunity of different sorts, not just in our specific segment, and the opportunity and the impact on the data security market that can be changed significantly. And I think by changing it can actually expand significantly as well. Data security market is limited by its ability to deliver, not by the type of problems it can solve. So those are the two opportunities that are going to drive the TAM for companies like BonFy.
It's interesting, right? Because I remember seeing an interview recently with Elon Musk, and it's 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, $100 million in ARR was amazing, and a $1 billion startup, a unicorn, was wow. It's incredible. Now it's like getting to these big numbers happens quicker and faster. So naturally, the new, the $1 billion company is the new $1 trillion company, the $1 million company is the new $1 billion company, right? So it only increases the TAM opportunity for companies like BonFy. What would you say is the thing that scares you about AI?
That it becomes really, really smart. I mean, as much as, we're talking about hallucinations, some flaws in models and all of that stuff, it's actually amazing. The set of it's not one technology, but it's an amazing set of technologies. They're just amazing. And I think there's a real risk to the human race in marginalizing what until now, at least we thought about ourselves, right, is the top of the food chain type of species that might be not true anymore one day. And I know that a lot of people are optimistic about like the industrial revolution, that technology has actually improved the quality of life, elevated the ability to use humans for what humans are really good at, which is using their brain, etc. But think about what happens when there's some other good brains, can work 24/7, less emotional, not as needy. Yeah, they need a lot of energy, but that's it, basically. So that can be actually pretty scary. That require not just technologies like what we provide, right? It's our business, but it probably will require more regulations. And I'm happy to see actually the Senate ban that was just announced yesterday on removing the ban on kind of state level kind of regulations, and the other type of regulations like in Europe, right? The EU AI Act and others, I think will be necessary to make sure, right, there's a great and proper use of those technologies, but they are not going to be abused and actually get out of control, which is, I think, likely will happen unless there will be some kind of proper controls in place. Again, technical controls like a company like us, but also governmental type of controls and moderations as well.
Can you control it though, if it gets out of hand?
Well, if it gets out of hand, maybe by definition of just getting out of hand, maybe not. But I think it's possible not to get it out of hand. Think about other kind of critical technology, think about nuclear power, right? It's possible, requires a lot of effort and a lot of international collaboration to control it. So is it possible? I think yes. Is it possible? Don't know. Not going to bet for it or against it. But I think it's possible.
It is like another concern, right? Like you're finding more and more people now dependent on AI, specifically technologies like ChatGPT. I mean, I walk past people in coffee shops and wherever, I'm walking down Manhattan, the amount of people I see just literally browsing, and they have ChatGPT in front of them, and you just begin to wonder what's happening to the atrophy of the brain. I mean, how quickly are these individuals starting to become less smart? You're diminishing your ability of relying on your way of thinking because you're relying on this technology to write an essay for you, to write an email for you, to respond to a client. It's all becoming very much driven.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's going to be a huge issue. It's part of what I mentioned earlier, that if until now we were at the top of the pack, the pecking order, many of us might not be anymore, right? So you can say, okay, now we're going to be squeezed by this species that the human race developed that is smarter, less needy, knows everything because he was trained on everything, and every piece of information on earth, or most of it at least, is at its disposal. It's tough to compete with that. So I agree that unless we understand as a society, right, out to globally, not just the US based, let's say, how to manage and where to utilize and where not to utilize, and we're making sure that we make sure that a lot of the humans are not going to be marginalized, it's going to be a rough future.
Wow, what a scary way to end the show, but
It
still
was
very.
not my intention, but you asked, I answered.
No, I think as we sort of touched on, right, the optimism and the paranoia is needed. It goes back to the core concept of the problem that you've gone after, the customer trust, right? Building that customer trust and protecting it. The way we're ending this is very much in line with the way you think about solving these problems. You've got to be aware of them. You'd be lying to yourself if you weren't aware of them. And he's talking about them. Gidi, final question. And it really has been a joy having you on this show and on this podcast. And I love working with you. You're definitely one of my favorite clients. As far as this show is concerned, it's all about learning. It's all about bringing amazing people like yourself on it and talk about the problems of our industry and how we're solving them, whether it's a founder, a CEO, a CTO, an investor, a VC. But one thing our listeners definitely care about is constantly learning and developing, right? Constantly pushing the boundaries. And one of the ways they do this is listening to guests like you, but also reading. I like to create a bit of a tradition, as we have been doing with this show, is to ask every guest to recommend a book, one that has resonated with you, one that has become an important book for you throughout your career. What would that book be?
Great question. And I love reading, by the way. I'm reading every day. You started by a question about a quote by Churchill and what does it mean to me. So, I love Churchill actually books, right, from all of the 6-volume books about World War II, but that's a big reading. I read, by the way, 3 times already, all of it. But I would want to recommend maybe something lighter related to Churchill, which is actually very relevant to what we discussed today, which is actually the Churchill Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. It's basically about a secret group that Churchill put together during World War II to tackle very complex problems. They came with crazy ideas. Many of them actually worked even in dealing, in finding kind of non-conventional ways to, again, deal with complex missions, complex challenges. In many, what part of the interesting part there is that many of them wasn't clear at all when they identified the problem, whether there's a solution even. And the ability, right, to understand what has to be done, right, what's the big mission, figure out how it can be done, and then executing through that is actually amazing. I think it's part of the one stance of Churchill as a leader, and definitely the group of individuals that were part of that in executing on this kind of high-level strategy. So it's actually a fun, super interesting book, and just another angle on what does it mean to tackle big challenges that not always ahead of time whether they're solvable at all.
How much of Churchill's unorthodox leadership or way of thinking, whether it's in his books, have you implemented in your way of thinking when it comes to leadership?
I think quite a lot, and I think it actually comes to what we talked about earlier, right, about portraying the future as being kind of what perceived as optimism. And I think I learned a lot from Churchill about it, that if someone reads of the 6-volume book and a lot of the letters that actually he wrote, so there are quotes, it's not just him telling about how good he was, but actually with a lot of supporting material of the communication that he had with generals and other leaders right along the war, that you see that he could, in extremely dark times, set strategies 2, 3, 4 years ahead, and actually being brave enough to, let's call it, guess or portray how the picture may look like, and find kind of the ways, the big, bold steps to get there. Sometimes he couldn't. Okay, so there were some, as probably everyone recalls, some big failures, right, during World War II, as kind of the British stood alone, right? It was a huge challenge. Nevertheless, right, he always had a plan. Always the plan was kind of multi-year plan before he knew that it's even possible, or maybe the condition even will be relevant for that. And then to be able to communicate it, that's part of I think, interesting part. It's not just a future race, right? I'm going to tell you about the future, and in fears, I'm going to tell you about the future at that point in time again, just 5 years later, right? It's about portraying kind of this picture and actually being able to communicate in a very clear way today to the team, to the generals, to other leaders, and actually rally the country in this case to actually find a way to execute through that, which I think is amazing. It's amazing and inspiring, and kind of tells you that it's possible. And that's again World War II, right? I'm not talking about just running a startup, which is slightly, simpler, I would say, than fighting the Axis right during the war. So I would say that's beyond inspiration. Just gives you kind of almost like a methodology and confidence that it's actually possible to be done. Again, does not guarantee success, but it guarantees that you have a way forward always, which is very mission oriented, and in many cases you'll be able to be successful.
It's kind of similar to, I don't know the exact quote. I think it's like Jeff Bezos. I read somewhere that there's sort of less an emphasis on the next 12 months and more of an emphasis on the next 12 years, right? Thinking far ahead. I think it's something he must have put up in his shareholder letter. And that focus on thinking into the future, looking into the future, seeing what's ahead. Quite similar to your thinking in terms of the company you've started and going after the bigger problems and being optimistic, but being cautious as well and paranoid.
Yeah, and maybe just one word on that. I think that converting a part of the equation here is, of course, as I said, and you said, right? Thinking ahead, looking far away, make sure you have the strategy. But the ability, as I mentioned earlier, right, with Churchill, is how to convert it to action item today, as opposed to leave it as just kind of like inspirational or aspirational targets and ideas, how to convert to something today, which I'm sure Jeff did an amazing job of that, obviously with Amazon. But again, getting back to Churchill, how you could, again, have some view of the future, find have some ideas of the strategy, and then the same day say, okay, here's what we need to do now or next few months. It's kind of the first steps in the direction, right? So how to tie to the here and now, and not just talk in future tense all the time. And that's, I think, part of what requires in leadership, requires in a lot of situations, also in startups.
Gidi, it's been a pleasure. Really, really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. I know our listeners will. We'll do it again in person next time. I could take so much away from today's, but I think one of the unique things that I'll take away is not just your focus on big problems, but how you think about leadership, how you think about building companies, which is really inspirational. Thank you so much. And thank you also for being an awesome client. It's always been a pleasure. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Gidi. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Inside the Silicon Mind. This podcast is powered by Harrison Clark. For more episodes, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. As always, stay curious, stay consistent, and stay inside the Silicon Mind.